You pour a drink into a glass. It foams for a moment. You raise it to your lips without giving it a second thought. Beer at a barbecue. Wine with dinner. A toast at a wedding. For most of us, alcohol feels like a modern invention, something tied to restaurants, breweries, and supermarkets. But what if your first drink happened long before cities existed? Long before farming? Long before pottery? Long before anyone knew what alcohol actually was? The strange truth is that humans may have been drinking naturally fermented alcohol for hundreds of thousands of years. Not because they wanted to get drunk, but because nature made it almost impossible to avoid. And some scientists believe that this accidental relationship with alcohol helped shape your species long before civilization ever began. By the end of this video, you'll see that your ability to tolerate alcohol isn't just a cultural habit. It may be an evolutionary inheritance passed down through countless generations of hungry hunter-gatherers. Around 10 million years ago, something unusual happened in the forests of Africa. There were no humans yet. Not even the earliest members of the genus Homo. Instead, the forests were home to ancient apes, the distant ancestors that would eventually give rise to chimpanzees, gorillas, and humans. Many of these primates relied heavily on fruit. Fresh fruit is rich in sugar. But sugar doesn't stay sugar forever. Once fruit becomes overripe, wild yeast floating through the air begins converting those sugars into ethanol. In other words, alcohol, this process requires no human involvement. No barrels. No recipes. No brewing. Just fruit, yeast, and time. Even today, researchers have measured naturally fermenting fruit containing small but detectable amounts of alcohol. Palm fruits in Panama, marula fruit in southern Africa, and figs across tropical forests all undergo this transformation. For an animal searching for calories, that smell can become surprisingly useful. In 2014, evolutionary biologist Matthew Kerrigan from Santa Fe College and his colleagues published a study in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. They examined a gene called ADH4. This gene produces an enzyme that helps break down ethanol inside the body. By comparing the DA of humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and other primates, the researchers discovered something remarkable. Around 10 million years ago, a mutation dramatically improved the efficiency of this enzyme in the common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas. According to their analysis, the new version processed ethanol roughly 40 times more efficiently than the older form. That timing wasn't random. Around the same period, climate changes were transforming African forests. Some fruit-bearing trees became less abundant. Food growing high in the canopy became harder to reach. Many primates gradually spent more time on the forest floor, and fruit that had fallen to the ground often sat there for days. It ripened. It fermented. It produced alcohol. Most animals ignored it once it became too soft. Your ancestors couldn't afford to. A fallen piece of fruit still contained valuable sugar. In a world where finding enough calories determined whether you survived another week, wasting food wasn't an option. Instead of avoiding fermented fruit, evolution favored individuals who could safely eat it. Over thousands of generations, that small advantage accumulated. Not because alcohol itself was valuable, because calories were. But here's where it gets stranger. Scientists now think the smell of alcohol may have become something your ancestors actively searched for. The smell of alcohol is surprisingly distinctive. Even at low concentrations, ethanol evaporates into the air faster than many other compounds released by ripe fruit. To you, it might smell sweet. Or slightly sour. To a hungry primate millions of years ago, it may have smelled like opportunity. In 2022, researchers studying wild black-handed spider monkeys in Panama measured naturally fermented fruit from the trees the animals regularly ate. The fruit contained measurable amounts of ethanol. When scientists later tested the monkeys' urine, they found metabolites showing that the alcohol had passed through their bodies. The monkeys weren't brewing alcohol. They weren't seeking intoxication. They were simply eating fruit exactly as it existed in nature. And in doing so, they may have been behaving much like your distant ancestors. This idea is known as the Drunken Monkey Hypothesis. It was first proposed by biological anthropologist Robert Dudley of the University of California, Berkeley. His argument is surprisingly simple. For millions of years, the scent of small amounts of ethanol acted as a signal that fruit was ripe and rich in calories. Animals capable of detecting that signal gained a small but meaningful advantage. They found food more efficiently. Over countless generations, natural selection may have strengthened this association. In other words, your brain may respond to alcohol today because your ancestors evolved to follow its scent long before anyone understood fermentation. But smelling alcohol is one thing. Drinking enough to become intoxicated is something entirely different. Natural fruit rarely contains high concentrations of ethanol. Most wild fruit measures well below 2% alcohol by volume, often much less. That's enough for your body to detect. Not enough to produce the effects associated with modern alcoholic drinks. The alcohol your ancestors encountered came in tiny amounts, spread across many meals. Their bodies processed it almost as quickly as they consumed it. This is one reason many researchers reject the popular image of prehistoric humans wandering through forests in a drunken state. The evidence simply doesn't support it. Instead, alcohol was likely an ordinary part of eating ripe fruit, almost invisible, almost unavoidable. But as human intelligence increased, something changed. People stopped waiting for nature to ferment fruit. They began creating the conditions themselves. Except there was a problem. For nearly all of prehistory, humans lived as hunter-gatherers. They moved with the seasons. They carried only what they needed. Deliberately producing alcohol requires one critical ingredient: time. Fermentation doesn't happen in minutes. It can take days, sometimes weeks. A mobile group couldn't easily leave containers behind and return later. They had no permanent villages, no dedicated storage buildings, and in most regions, no pottery. The oldest widely accepted pottery appears in southern China around 20,000 years ago, but it remained rare for thousands of years and wasn't originally made for brewing alcohol. Without stable containers, controlled fermentation would have been extremely difficult. So, for hundreds of thousands of years, humans probably consumed only naturally fermented foods and fruits created by chance. Then the climate changed. Around 11,700 years ago, the last ice age ended. Temperatures rose. Rainfall patterns shifted. Wild grains became more abundant in parts of the Fertile Crescent, stretching across modern-day Israel, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and southeastern Turkey. Some hunter-gatherer groups began staying in the same places for longer periods. One remarkable example is the Natufian culture, which lived between about 15,000 and 11,500 years ago. Unlike earlier mobile groups, many Natufian communities built semi-permanent stone houses. They harvested wild cereals, they stored food, and for the first time they possessed something prehistoric people had rarely enjoyed. They had enough time to let nature work. But here's where the archaeological evidence becomes truly unexpected. Some researchers now believe that the earliest known alcoholic drinks may have appeared before agriculture itself. In 2018, archaeologists working at Rakefet Cave on Mount Carmel, Israel, uncovered something extraordinary. The cave had once been used by the Natufian culture nearly 13,000 years ago. At first glance, the discovery didn't look remarkable. Researchers found several shallow stone mortars carved directly into the cave floor. Similar features had been discovered before, but microscopic analysis revealed something unexpected. The mortars contained traces of starch granules that had been crushed, heated, and partially fermented. The study, led by archaeologist Li Lu from Stanford University, concluded that the Natufians had likely produced a primitive fermented beverage made from wild wheat and barley. If the interpretation is correct, this represents the oldest known evidence of intentional alcohol production, and it happened before farming became widespread. That challenges one of the oldest assumptions in archaeology. For decades, many researchers believed agriculture came first. Beer came later. But discoveries like Rakefet Cave suggest the relationship may have been more complicated. Some archaeologists now wonder whether the desire to produce fermented drinks encouraged people to collect larger amounts of grain. Perhaps farming wasn't simply about making bread. Perhaps, in part, it was also about making alcohol. The idea remains debated. Many researchers still argue that bread and reliable food storage were the primary drivers of agriculture. Others believe fermented beverages played only a small ceremonial role. The evidence isn't complete. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear. Alcohol entered human history much earlier than anyone once imagined. And even then, it probably wasn't an everyday drink. The Natufians appear to have produced it in small quantities. Most researchers believe it was prepared for communal feasts, celebrations, or funerary rituals rather than daily consumption. In other words, alcohol may have begun as something deeply social, not recreational. Throughout prehistory, survival depended on cooperation. Groups shared food, raised children together, protected one another from predators. Strong social bonds increased the chances that everyone survived. Anthropologists have long argued that communal rituals strengthened those bonds during an important gathering, may have reinforced trust, memory, and group identity in ways ordinary meals could not. Thousands of years later, as agriculture spread across the Near East, deliberate brewing became easier. Permanent villages appeared. Stored grain became common. Pottery improved. Fermentation could finally be controlled instead of simply discovered. By around 5,000 years ago, civilizations in Mesopotamia were producing beer on a much larger scale. But by then, humans had already been living alongside naturally occurring alcohol for millions of years. The remarkable part isn't that your ancestors invented alcohol. Nature had already done that. What changed was your relationship with it. At first, alcohol was simply another feature of ripe fruit lying on a forest floor. Then it became an occasional byproduct of stored plants. Eventually, it became something people intentionally created, shared, and celebrated. That journey mirrors something much larger about human evolution. Again and again, our species took ordinary parts of nature and slowly transformed them into culture. Fire became cooking, stone became tools, seeds became agriculture, and naturally fermented fruit became one of humanity's oldest shared traditions. The next time you see a glass of beer or wine on a table, it's easy to think you're looking at a product of modern civilization. In reality, you're looking at the latest chapter of a story that may have begun 10 million years ago, when one of your distant ancestors picked up an overripe piece of fruit from the forest floor, smelled the faint scent of ethanol, and decided it was still worth eating. That decision wasn't the beginning of drinking. It was the beginning of becoming human.